40 seconds. That's how long the phone call lasted before my former CEO realized he had just destroyed his own career. I had just sold my company for $20 million. The papers were signed. The money would hit my account in a few days. I thought the hardest part was finally over. But when my lawyer finished reviewing the contract, he didn't congratulate me. Instead, he said something strange. "Before you celebrate," he said, "call your former CEO and tell him you lost the money." I thought he was joking. Why would I tell anyone I had just lost $20 million? But my lawyer looked completely serious. And that phone call ended up exposing something my former CEO had been hiding for years. Back in my lawyer's office, Michael slid the acquisition agreement across the desk. 8 pages of signatures, 2 years of work, $20 million on the line. If everything closed on schedule, the first wire would hit my account within days. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Then Michael said, "Your former CEO." The room went quiet. "You want me to call Grant Kellerman?" "Yes." "Why?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "When he answers," he said, "tell him the deal collapsed." I frowned. "What?" "Tell him you lost the $20 million. I stared at him. "Why would I lie about that?" Michael opened a thin folder and turned one of the pages toward me. Printed emails. Some from me. Some from Grant. "You told me Grant promised you the director of operations role if you completed the Aurora project," Michael said. "He did. And when the project succeeded, he gave the job to someone else." I nodded. "That's why I left." Michael tapped the email. "Daniel, your CEO didn't just break his word." My stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the legal picture around Aurora may be more complicated than Grant thinks." I frowned. "Aurora was built at North Star." "Yes," Michael said. "But parts of the architecture trace back to work you designed. Work the company may never have formally secured." I felt my pulse rise. "That can't be what this is." "Maybe not," he said. "But if Grant believes you just lost $20 million, he may panic." Michael closed the folder. "And when men like Grant panic," he said quietly, "they reach for control." The plan began forming in my head. "That you want him to expose himself?" Michael nodded. "Exactly." He slid my phone across the desk. "Call him." I looked down at the screen. Grant Kellerman. For 7 years, he called me indispensable. The man who kept everything running, right up until the moment he handed my promotion to someone else. Michael folded his hands. "If I'm wrong, nothing happens," he said. "And if you're right," I asked. He gave a small smile. "Then Grant will tell us exactly what he's afraid of." I stared at the phone for one more second. Then I hit dial. "Before I tell you what Grant said when he picked up that call, you need to understand what those years at North Star actually looked like. Because what happened between us didn't begin with that phone call. It began with a promise. When I joined North Star Precision, the company was growing faster than its systems could handle. We manufactured precision components for medical devices, which meant when production failed, clients noticed immediately. On paper, I was hired as a systems engineer. At North Star, I was usually the only woman in the engineering room. At 35, I thought I finally understood how companies really worked. In practice, I became the person people called when something important broke. Scheduling system crashes at midnight. "Call Daniel. Supplier data corrupted before a production run. Danielle will fix it." A shipment delay threatening 2 factories. "Someone wake Danielle up." For a while, I didn't mind. I liked solving problems. Systems made sense to me in a way corporate politics never did. At North Star, that made me useful. And eventually, people stopped thanking useful people. They just start expecting them. About 2 years into my time there, the company began planning something bigger. They called it the Aurora Optimization Program. Aurora was designed to connect supplier logistics, machine diagnostics, and delivery forecasting into a predictive system. If it worked, factories could detect failures before they happened. If it worked, it would save the company millions. Grant Kellerman introduced the project during a leadership meeting. Later that afternoon, he walked over to my desk. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I want you to lead Aurora." I looked up. "Lead it? Yes, this project is critical. If we pull it off, it changes everything." "Why me?" Grant smiled. "Because you're the only person here who actually understands how all our systems fit together." Then he added the sentence that locked the next 2 years of my life into place. "Deliver Aurora successfully," he said. "And the director of operations role is yours." I asked him to repeat that, and officially mine. He nodded. "You finish this project cleanly," Grant said. and I'll make sure the board approves it. After that conversation, Aurora stopped being a project. It became my life. Nights, rewriting algorithms. Weekends, installing sensors across 3 plants. More than once, I slept on the office couch and went home the next morning in the same shirt. Twice, the entire system nearly collapsed. The first time, a supplier missed a shipment and production stopped across 2 plants. My phone rang at 5:30 a.m. "Daniel," Grant said, "fix this." 14 hours later, the production lines were moving again. Grant called back that evening. "Exactly why I trusted you with Aurora," he said. The second incident came 3 days before a major client audit. When a vendor update corrupted Aurora's forecasting module, when Grant walked into the server room, I'd already been there for hours. "I knew you'd be here," he said. "Give me 6 hours." I told him. It took 8. But when the auditors arrived the next morning, Aurora ran perfectly. After the review, Grant shook my hand in front of the entire operations team. "Outstanding work," he said. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Keep going," he said quietly. "The director position is coming for the next 18 months. Every major decision I made revolved around that promise. The late nights, the weekends, the constant emergencies, all of it made sense if the future Grant described was real. What I didn't realize back then, Cud, was that the future he promised me had already been given to someone else. The Aurora system launched on a Monday morning. I remember the exact time because I hadn't slept the night before. At 7:42 a.m., the production dashboards lit up across all 3 North Star facilities. Supplier data flowed through the network exactly the way I had designed it. Machine sensors reported diagnostics in real time. Delivery forecasts updated automatically every 15 minutes. For the first time in the company's history, every production line moved in sync. Aurora worked. By noon, our largest client called the operations office, and they didn't ask for Grant, they asked for me. "Daniel," the client's director said over speakerphone, "this system is incredible. We've never seen production data this accurate." I thanked him. But what I felt most in that moment wasn't pride. It was relief. 18 months of late nights and emergency fixes had finally paid off. And in my mind, that meant one thing, the promotion Grant had promised. 2 weeks later, the operations division gathered for the quarterly leadership meeting. Everyone in the room knew Aurora had succeeded. As I walked in, a few engineers slapped my shoulder. "Looks like you're moving upstairs," one of them said. Another laughed. "About time." I smiled politely and took a seat near the front. Grant walked onto the stage a few minutes later, tablet in hand, wearing the confident expression he always used before making an announcement. "Before we begin the performance review," he said, "I'd like to recognize a leadership transition within the operations division." My pulse quickened. "This role will guide the next phase of Aurora's expansion," he continued. Several people around the table glanced in my direction. I sat a little straighter. Then he said the name. "I'm pleased to announce our new director of operations, Marissa Cole." For a moment, the room didn't move. Marissa stood from the second row. For a second, I thought she was just stepping aside for someone else. Then she walked toward the stage. She had joined North Star only 3 months earlier. She spoke well in meetings, understood executive language, and seemed perfectly comfortable around senior leadership. But Aurora wasn't her system. Not a single sleepless night of it. She walked to the stage smiling like the announcement had never been in doubt. Grant shook her hand. People began clapping, some out of confusion, some because they didn't know what else to do. I didn't clap. I didn't move. I just sat there while something inside me went completely quiet. When the applause faded, Grant started explaining how Marissa would lead the next phase of Aurora integration. She thanked everyone and promised to continue the incredible work already started. Started, not built, started. After the meeting, a couple engineers stopped me near the exit. "That was supposed to be you," one of them said quietly. Another shook his head. "This doesn't make any sense." But standing there, watching Grant laugh with Marissa across the room, it finally did. Aurora had never been about rewarding the person who built it. It had been about keeping that person useful long enough for someone else to take the credit. And by the time I walked out of that room, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't confront Grant in the hallway. I didn't argue during the meeting, and I didn't make a scene. Instead, I walked back to my desk, opened my laptop, and reread the email he had sent 18 months earlier. Subject, Aurora Project, Leadership. The message was short. Complete Aurora successfully, and the Director of Operations role will be yours. There it was, in writing. For a moment, I considered fighting it, forwarding the email to HR, escalating it to the board, forcing the conversation in front of everyone. But the truth had already settled in. People who break promises that easily don't rediscover integrity just because you argue harder. So instead of writing a complaint, I wrote 2 sentences, I printed them, then I walked to Grant's office. He was on the phone when I stepped in, pacing slowly behind his desk. When he saw me, he raised one finger, his signal to wait. I didn't. I placed the envelope on his desk and turned to leave. "Daniel, hold on," he said, ending the call. "What's this, my resignation?" He opened the envelope and scanned the page. His eyes moved across the letter once. Then he read it again. The color drained from his face. "You're joking." "I'm not." Grant leaned back in his chair as if the room had shifted under him. "You can't leave," he said. "Why not?" "Because Aurora just launched," he said, his voice tightening. "You're the only person who understands how that system actually works." I let the words hang in the air. "Apparently not." Grant stood up. "Daniel, don't do this. You're upset about the announcement. I get that, but decisions like that happen at multiple levels. Did the email come from multiple levels too?" I asked quietly. I slid my phone across the desk. The message was open on the screen. Grant stared at it for a long moment. His jaw tightened. "That wasn't a formal offer," he said finally. "You misunderstood the context." Something inside me settled into place. "So the plan was always the same, but I said, have me build Aurora, then hand it to someone else." "You're being emotional," Grant replied. "You're essential to this company. People like you are the backbone of operations. People like me, yes. Reliable, consistent, the kind who keep the engine running while someone else takes credit for driving it." Grant lowered his voice. "Marissa isn't ready to run Aurora yet. The clients depend on you. Stay through the transition and we'll work something out." I shook my head. "That sounds like your problem." His expression hardened. "If you walk out now, Daniel, don't expect a reference from this company." I met his eyes. "I'll take my chances." Grant gripped the resignation letter so tightly the paper crumpled in his hand. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked scared. And in that moment, I understood something. Grant Kellerman wasn't panicking because I was leaving. He was panicking because the moment I walked out that door, he lost control of the one system his entire reputation now depended on. And I was about to walk out anyway. For 3 months after leaving North Star, I didn't think about Grant Kellerman at all. Not because I had forgiven what happened, but because I was finally building something that belonged to me. Aurora had taught me a lesson. If you're going to work that hard for something, it should probably be yours. Long before Aurora became a company project, I'd been developing a smaller logistics model on my own time. The framework was simpler, but the core idea was the same: predict problems before they happened. After leaving North Star, I rebuilt that independent version from scratch and turned it into a real product. 6 months later, a mid-sized logistics software company offered to acquire it. 2 weeks later, I was sitting across from my lawyer, staring at a final agreement worth $20 million. I thought the story ended there. Michael didn't. He closed the contract folder and looked at me. "Daniel, can I ask you something about Aurora?" "What about it? Did you ever sign an intellectual property assignment for that system?" I thought back through everything I had signed at North Star, then shook my head. "No." Michael nodded slowly. "That's what I suspected." A faint unease moved through me. "Why does that matter?" He opened another folder. Inside were printouts from North Star's public announcements, all presenting Aurora as a major company asset. "Grant Kellerman is treating Aurora like it's unquestionably North Star's," Michael said. "Well, it is company technology," I replied automatically. Michael slid another sheet across the desk. It was one of my old emails from the early days of the project. Attached was the original architecture diagram. My name sat clearly at the bottom. Michael chose his next words carefully. "If Aurora's underlying design was never properly assigned, North Star's ownership position may be weaker than Grant thinks." I stared at him. "That can't be right." "Maybe not," Michael said. "But if Grant has been presenting Aurora as a clean company asset, he may be standing on a dangerous assumption." I looked back at the documents. Aurora had become the backbone of North Star's operations. Grant had built his reputation around it. Michael tapped the acquisition contract again. "That's why I want you to call him," he said. "But why the phone call?" I asked. Michael gave a small smile. "Because right now your former CEO thinks you're powerless. $20 million changes that, he said. The moment you have resources, you stop looking like a former employee and start looking like a legal problem. He tapped the acquisition agreement. But if Grant Kellerman believes you just lost $20 million, he let the sentence hang. There's a good chance he'll panic. And men like Grant don't panic quietly. I understood the plan immediately. You want him to try locking down Aurora? Michael nodded. Exactly. He slid my phone across the desk. Call him and tell him you lost the money. Because if Grant Kellerman believed I was desperate again, he might make the one move that proved exactly how much Aurora and I were really worth. I stepped out of Michael's office and dialed Grant. Grant answered on the third ring. Danielle. His voice sounded exactly the same as I remembered, calm, controlled, faintly impatient. For a second, I almost hung up. Then I remembered Michael sitting across from me in that quiet office, the folder of documents, the plan. Something happened. I said, a short pause. What do you mean, the acquisition deal I mentioned? It collapsed. Another pause. The buyer pulled out during due diligence. I let the silence sit before finishing. I lost the 20 million. For a moment, there was nothing. Not confusion, calculation. I could almost picture Grant in his glass office at North Star, realizing the situation had changed. Finally, he spoke. That's unfortunate. The sympathy sounded practiced. I imagine that changes a few things for you, such as, but maybe this gives us an opportunity, he said, for what to fix things between us. I said nothing. You're a talented engineer. Danielle. Everyone at North Star knows that. Engineer, not creator. Engineer. If you're reconsidering your next move, he continued, there might still be a place for you here. Doing what Aurora is entering its expansion phase. Marissa is handling strategy, but she'll need someone with your technical familiarity. Technical familiarity. So, you want me back? Potentially, Grant said carefully, but there are a few loose ends we'd need to clear up first. What kind of loose ends? I heard the faint tapping of keys. You should receive an email in a moment, he said. 2 seconds later, my phone buzzed. Subject, Aurora Clarification Agreement, 6 pages, 6. The document stated that Aurora and all related architecture were the sole intellectual property of North Star Precision Systems. Further down, another clause required me to waive any claim to the system's design. If you sign that, Grant said smoothly, we can talk about bringing you back. He paused. You've had a rough few months. Losing that kind of money can shake anyone. Another pause. This might be a good time to settle things cleanly. 6 pages, 1 signature. And Aurora would officially become Grant Kellerman's story. I'll review it, I said. Good. Grant replied quietly. And Danielle, I'm glad you called. The line went dead. I forwarded the email to Michael. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. That, he said calmly, is exactly what I needed. Michael didn't waste time. Less than 24 hours after Grant sent the agreement, a formal legal notice arrived at North Star Precision Systems. Inside a corporate boardroom, it didn't need to be dramatic. The notice listed 3 facts. Danielle Carter had never signed an intellectual property assignment covering the Aurora system. Aurora's core architecture had been originally designed and documented by Danielle Carter, and any claim that the technology belonged exclusively to North Star could expose the company to legal liability. At the bottom was one final sentence. We request immediate clarification from the North Star board regarding the ownership status of the Aurora optimization system. That was enough. 48 hours later, Grant Kellerman was called into an emergency board meeting, and so was I. The boardroom looked familiar. Same long table, same glass wall overlooking the factory floor, but the atmosphere was very different. 3 board members sat at the table with the CFO and 2 corporate attorneys. Grant sat near the head of the table, calm as ever. When I walked in, he even smiled. Daniel, he said casually, good to see you. Michael ignored him. He set his laptop on the table and waited. One of the board members spoke first. Mr. Kellerman, we've received a legal inquiry regarding Aurora's intellectual property. Grant leaned back in his chair. There's nothing to clarify, he said smoothly. Aurora was developed as part of North Star's internal operations strategy. Michael opened his laptop. The screen at the end of the room lit up. Let's start here. An email appeared. Subject Aurora Architecture Draft. Danielle Carter. The document contained the original system framework, and at the bottom my name. Michael clicked again. Another email appeared. This one written by Grant. Danielle built the framework. We'll keep the board discussion focused on leadership. Grant leaned forward slightly. Danielle contributed to the system, he said calmly. But Aurora was developed inside North Star. The company funded the entire project. Michael didn't raise his voice, and that would normally be correct. He said, except Ms. Carter never signed an intellectual property assignment for the underlying architecture. Grant's expression tightened. Michael reached into his folder. Without another word, he placed a document on the table. The room went quiet. One of the board members picked it up and began reading. Halfway down the page, she stopped. She looked up slowly. Mr. Kellerman. She turned the document toward the others. This agreement was sent yesterday. Her voice remained calm. But it requires Ms. Carter to waive any future claim to Aurora's design. Another director frowned. Why would that be necessary? He asked quietly. If the company already owned the system, Grant reached for the document. For the first time that morning, his hand wasn't steady. The board chair spoke before his fingers touched the paper. Leave it where it is. Mr. Kellerman. Grant froze. This is being misrepresented, he said quickly. Aurora was developed under my leadership. The company funded the entire. One of the board members interrupted. Mr. Kellerman, she said calmly, tapping the printed email on the table. The issue isn't who funded the project. She turned the page so the entire room could see the message on the screen. The issue is that you already knew who built it. Grant opened his mouth again, then closed it. Around the table, no one spoke. Inside a boardroom, silence can weigh more than an admission. By the end of that week, Grant Kellerman had been placed on administrative leave. 3 days later, after an emergency legal review, North Star announced his termination as CEO. Officially, the reason was leadership misconduct and inaccurate corporate reporting. Unofficially, everyone inside the company knew exactly what had happened. The man who built his reputation on Aurora had just been undone by the person who actually built it. About a month after Grant Kellerman was removed as CEO, my phone rang again. This time the number belonged to North Star's board office. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then curiosity won. Danielle Carter speaking? A calm voice answered. Ms. Carter, this is Elaine Porter from the North Star board. I leaned back in my chair. Yes, we wanted to speak with you about Aurora and the future of the operations division. I didn't respond. She continued. The board has completed its internal review. It's clear now that your work was central to the system's success. That was the closest thing to an apology I expected. Then she said something I hadn't anticipated. We would like to offer you the position of Director of Operations. The title hung in the air. The same position I had spent nearly 2 years working toward. Elaine continued. The compensation package includes a significant salary increase, a signing bonus, and equity participation in Aurora's expansion. I looked out the window of my office. 3 months earlier, hearing those words would have meant everything to me. Now they felt distant. Elaine waited. So, she asked gently, what do you think? I took a slow breath. Then I answered, no. There was a brief silence. May I ask why she said? I glanced around the office, and the glass wall behind me displayed the name of the company I had started after leaving North Star. 7 employees, 7 clients, and growing every week. Because, I said quietly, I already built something better. Elaine didn't argue. She wished me well and ended the call. 3 months later, the company I started was growing faster than I expected. The predictive logistics system we built began attracting attention across the industry. Clients started calling, then referrals followed. Within a single quarter, we signed 7 major contracts. One of them used to be North Star's largest manufacturing client. I heard a few things about Grant over the next couple of months. Nothing official, of course. News like that travels quietly. The board's internal review had raised more questions about how Aurora had been presented to investors. Once those questions started circulating, Grant's reputation moved through the industry faster than any press release. By the time winter arrived, I was told he was consulting for a much smaller firm outside Chicago, a long way from the glass office he once ran at North Star. Apparently, they preferred working with the person who actually understood the system. A few weeks later, I met Michael Reed for coffee, the same quiet cafe where we had first discussed the acquisition. He stirred his coffee slowly and looked at me. So, he said, did you really lose $20 million? I smiled. No. Michael raised an eyebrow. Seems like you came out ahead. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't lose $20 million. I paused. I just stopped working for someone who thought my work belonged to him. Have you ever worked under a boss who tried to take credit for what you built? If you were Danielle, what would you have done? Would you go back to North Star as director or walk away and build your own company? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about office drama, corporate betrayal, and people finally reclaiming what they built, you may want to stick around here. There are many more stories like this coming. 200 executives were watching when my boss's son threw champagne in my face. Then he pointed at me and told his father, "The CEO, fire her, or you'll regret it." And the worst part? His father actually did. The next morning, I was escorted out of the building I had spent 7 years helping build. But a few hours later, the CEO called me back. His voice sounded very different this time. He said only 4 words. "Claire, we need you. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old." Until the night of Apex Global's spring gala, I honestly believed hard work protected you. Not completely, not forever, but enough. The ballroom at the Chicago Hilton was full of polished conversations, expensive perfume, and the kind of people who smiled while calculating what everyone else in the room was worth. Investors, board members, senior leadership, and international partners filled the space beneath the chandeliers. At the center of all of it was the deal I had spent 6 months building, a $185 million logistics partnership with Altair Logistics. If it closed, Apex would finally break into the Middle Eastern shipping market in a serious way, and the division I had spent 7 years building would become the backbone of that expansion. I was standing near the investor tables, reviewing the final schedule with Altair's delegation, when the mood in the room changed, not gradually. All at once, the ballroom doors opened hard enough to turn heads. Logan Pierce walked in, 21 years old, son of Apex's CEO, dressed for the occasion, but not composed for it. His tie hung loose, and the look on his face told me 2 things immediately: he had been drinking, and he had come looking for someone. Me. He crossed the ballroom in a straight line, ignoring the people who stepped aside for him. By the time he reached me, nearby conversations had already begun to die. "Claire Bennett," he said loudly, as if my name itself were an accusation. I kept my voice level. "Good evening, Logan." He gave a short laugh, sharp and ugly enough that more people turned. "She's useless," he said. Not quietly, not to me, to the room. Before I could answer, he took a champagne glass from a passing server and threw it straight into my face. The cold hit first, then the silence. Champagne ran down my hair, my dress, my collarbone. Somewhere to my left, I heard someone gasp. No one moved. Logan pointed past me toward the stage, where his father stood frozen beside 2 board members. "Fire her," he said. His voice carried farther this time. "Or I swear you'll regret it." Every eye in the ballroom shifted to Daniel Pierce, CEO of Apex Global. Logan's father, a man who had absolutely seen what had just happened. And still, he didn't move. My face burned, not from pain, from humiliation. For one reckless second, I wanted to throw the empty glass back at him. I wanted to say something loud enough to crack the whole room open. Instead, I wiped champagne from my cheek with the back of my hand, steadied my breathing, and said the only thing that wouldn't make me look as ugly as the scene he had created. "Excuse me." Then I walked out of the ballroom. Behind me, a room full of investors, board members, and senior executives stood in stunned silence. Most of them probably thought they had just watched the end of my career. They were wrong. What happened in that ballroom set something else in motion, something Logan Pierce never saw coming. The next morning, my phone rang at 7:12 a.m. Apex never called that early unless something had already gone bad. The message from HR was brief and formal. "Claire, Mr. Pierce would like to see you in his office this morning." No explanation, no attempt to soften it. I arrived at headquarters a little after 8. The lobby felt wrong the second I stepped inside. People who normally greeted me with coffee jokes and quick morning updates suddenly found very important reasons to study their phones or adjust papers they didn't need to adjust. By the time I reached the executive floor, I understood why. Everyone knew about the gala. Daniel Pierce was standing behind his desk when I walked into his office. He looked older than he had the night before. Not angry, not defensive, just tired in the way people look when they've spent the night trying to convince themselves they're still in control. For a few seconds, he said nothing. He just stared down at the folder on his desk as though the right words might be waiting for him there. Then he cleared his throat. "Claire, I'm afraid we need to make a change." He still didn't look at me. When he finally did, but the phrase he used was exactly what I expected. Leadership alignment. the kind of corporate language people reach for when they mean damage control. Investors had already started calling that morning. The board had seen the video. Legal and HR were almost certainly telling him the same thing, separate the parties, contain the fallout, stop the story from growing before the market, and everyone else started asking harder questions. He wasn't choosing fairness. He was choosing containment. And in that moment, I was the easier person to remove. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I studied his face for a moment. There was regret there, but not enough of it. "Understood." I said, no argument, no protest, no scene, just the word. I went back to my office and began packing my desk. I had spent 7 years building Apex's international division from a 2-person operation into the company's fastest growing revenue stream. I had negotiated impossible timelines, salvaged client relationships, and worked enough weekends to stop pretending I still had boundaries. And now I was clearing out my office before lunch because a 21-year-old had thrown a drink at me in front of the wrong audience. The whispers started almost immediately. Some people looked sorry for me. Others avoided eye contact, as if bad luck might spread by proximity. By 9:30, my desk was empty. Before I left the building, I opened my laptop one last time and sent Daniel a single email. No anger, no accusations, just documentation, meeting records, contract notes, final negotiation schedules, and one attachment, the complete Altair logistics contract. Then I closed my laptop and walked out of the building. Daniel probably thought it was a routine handoff. It wasn't. It was the document that would force everyone at Apex to read what they should have read before they fired me. Hours later, Daniel Pierce finally opened the email I had sent before leaving the building. At first, it looked exactly like what he expected: routine handover material, internal documentation, negotiation records, the kind of professional cleanup employees sometimes leave behind when they're pushed out of a company. He skimmed through the files quickly: meeting summaries, negotiation timelines, draft revisions of the Altair contract. Nothing unusual. Then he opened the attachment labeled Final Agreement, Altair Logistics. Daniel had seen the contract before, at least in broad terms. The board had approved the deal months earlier, but like most executives, he had relied on legal summaries rather than reading every page of the operational authority language. This time, something caught his attention. Section 14, a clause buried deep in the execution terms. Daniel leaned closer to the screen and read it once. Then again. Then a third time. The clause had been added 2 years earlier after a disastrous negotiation with another international partner, a protection clause, one I had insisted on after that experience. The wording was simple, but very specific. Only Claire Bennett is authorized to conduct and finalize negotiations with Altair Logistics on behalf of Apex Global. There was a reason for that language. The agreement involved Arabic regulatory approvals, government shipping clearances, and cross-border compliance procedures tied to filings already registered under Apex's International Operations Division. Altair had also made it clear during earlier negotiations in Dubai that they expected the same lead negotiator to finish the deal, and at Apex, there was only one person who fit both requirements. I was the only negotiator currently registered under the company's Arabic compliance certifications, and the only one fluent enough to handle the regulatory discussions directly. Without me in the room, the negotiation authority didn't just become awkward, it became vulnerable, legally, practically, operationally. Daniel's expression slowly changed as the implications settled in. Without Claire Bennett present, the Altair contract could not be finalized under the terms that had already been approved, and Altair Logistics would have every legal right to walk away. The value of the deal was printed clearly on the first page. $185 million. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Then something else appeared on his screen. A new message from the board chairman. There was an attachment, a short video clip. Daniel clicked it. The gala ballroom filled the screen. Logan's voice echoed through the speakers. "She's useless." The video showed the moment the champagne glass left his hand, the liquid hitting my face, 200 people in the room going silent, and Daniel standing on the stage, doing absolutely nothing. When the video ended, the chairman's message appeared beneath it. "We need to discuss both the contract and the video, immediately." Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. Because the final meeting with Altair's CEO was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and Claire Bennett no longer worked for Apex Global. Daniel Pierce called me 3 times that afternoon. I watched his name flash across my phone each time and let it ring until the screen went dark. After the fourth attempt, the calls stopped. Inside Apex headquarters, things were far less quiet. Within an hour, an emergency meeting had been pulled together on the executive floor. Legal, finance, compliance, and several board members were gathered around the long conference table while others joined through secure video calls. The Altair contract was projected across the main screen. The legal director spoke first. "We have a problem." He stepped closer to the screen and tapped the document. Section 14. This clause requires Claire Bennett's presence to finalize the agreement. Logan leaned back in his chair. "Then replace her." The legal director didn't react. "We legally can't." Logan's confidence faltered for the first time. "That's ridiculous." The compliance officer answered this time. "The regulatory approvals tied to this agreement require a certified negotiator registered under Apex's Arabic compliance authorization. Claire Bennett is currently the only person listed under those filings." The room went quiet. Logan looked from one executive to another, waiting for someone to contradict it. No one did. He scoffed, then stalled them. But the problem was already larger than a scheduling delay. Altair Logistics had flown their delegation into Chicago that morning. Their CEO, Omar Haddad, was scheduled to finalize the agreement in less than 24 hours, and now the board had seen the video. The clip from the gala was already circulating quietly among investors. Logan throwing champagne, Logan shouting, Logan demanding that I be fired. No one in the room said it out loud, but the calculation had already begun. Altair Logistics wasn't just another contract. It represented the largest international expansion Apex had attempted in more than a decade. Without that deal, the company's projected growth for the next quarter would collapse. Investor confidence would drop. Analysts would start asking questions. And if Altair walked away after watching the CEO's son publicly humiliate the one negotiator authorized to close the deal, the damage wouldn't stop at a single contract. It would spread, meanwhile, across the city. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching my phone light up again and again. Missed calls, voicemails, unknown numbers, legal, finance, even HR. I ignored all of them until one final message appeared on the screen from Daniel Pierce. Just 3 words. "Claire, we need to talk." I agreed to meet Daniel Pierce, but not at Apex. If he wanted the conversation, then he could come to me. We met at a quiet cafe 3 blocks from the river, the kind of place where executives hold uncomfortable conversations away from glass conference rooms and curious employees. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early. He looked worse than he had that morning. His tie was loose. His shoulders were tight. The calm, controlled CEO most people knew had been replaced by a man who had clearly spent the day putting out fires he could no longer contain. "Claire," he said as he sat down, "about last night. I'm sorry." I raised a hand before he could continue. "This isn't about apologies." He stopped. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Pierce looked less like a CEO and more like someone trying to manage a disaster that had already moved beyond his control. So I laid out the terms, not dramatically, but just clearly. First, I said, I returned to finalize the Altair deal with full operational authority. He nodded immediately. That part wasn't negotiable. Second, I continued, Logan Pierce has 0 involvement in negotiations, strategy, or communications related to the international division. Daniel hesitated, only briefly, but the hesitation was there. Finally, he nodded again. Agreed. Third, I said, there will be a formal review of executive authority inside Apex. What happened last night can't happen again, not to me, and not to anyone else. This time, the silence lasted longer. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. The Altair meeting was scheduled for the next morning. The clock was not on his side. Finally, he exhaled. "You'll have it in writing." That afternoon, I walked back into Apex headquarters, through the front entrance. Not the side employee entrance, the main lobby. The same lobby I had walked out of less than a day earlier after clearing my desk. The moment I stepped inside, conversation slowed, then stopped. People stared. Everyone in the building had heard what happened at the gala. Everyone had heard I was gone. But now I was back, and I wasn't carrying a box. Across the lobby, Logan Pierce stood near the elevators talking to 2 managers. He saw me immediately. The smile on his face faded. For the first time since this began, Something new appeared in his expression. Not anger, not arrogance, recognition. Logan Pierce had just realized that the situation he thought he had ended the night before wasn't finished yet. The next morning, Apex headquarters felt like a pressure chamber. Everyone in the building knew what was at stake. At exactly 9 a.m., the Altair delegation arrived. 5 executives in dark suits stepped through the lobby doors, led by their CEO, Omar Haddad, a man with a reputation for walking away from negotiations the moment he sensed instability on the other side of the table. Daniel Pierce personally escorted them upstairs to the executive boardroom. Legal had already made one thing clear that morning: only the approved negotiation team would be allowed inside the room. As the boardroom doors opened, Logan Pierce appeared at the end of the hallway. He moved quickly toward them. "I'll handle this meeting," he said. Daniel didn't even look at him. "Not today." Logan stopped a few steps from the door. "This is my company, too." Daniel finally turned to face him. For a moment, the hallway was completely still. Then Daniel said quietly, "Not today." The boardroom door closed between them. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. I stood as Omar Haddad entered the room, then I greeted him in Arabic. "Welcome to Chicago. Mr. Haddad, I hope your flight was comfortable." The shift was immediate. Omar's expression softened, the first relaxed moment anyone in the room had seen since his arrival. "You remembered," he said. Of course, the meeting began. Contracts were reviewed, shipping routes confirmed, regulatory documentation examined page by page. 6 months of negotiations moved forward exactly as planned. Until halfway through the meeting, Omar leaned back slightly and looked around the room. Then he asked one quiet question. "Before we continue, but I'd like to understand something." The room went still. He looked directly at me. "Is your leadership stable?" For a moment, no one answered. I could feel the board members watching carefully. I spoke calmly. "We're correcting a leadership problem." No explanation, no corporate spin, just the truth. Omar held my gaze for another second. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said. 2 hours later, the final pages were signed. Pens touched paper, hands were shaken. The $185 million partnership between Apex Global and Altair Logistics was officially secured. Outside the boardroom doors, Logan Pierce stood in the hallway. When the applause broke out inside the room, he heard every second of it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't inside the room where the real decisions were being made. And men like Logan Pierce rarely forget moments like that. They answer them, usually with retaliation. For about 2 weeks after the Altair deal, Apex pretended to be normal again. Meetings resumed, deadlines returned. People acted as if the chaos from the gala and the emergency negotiations had been neatly folded away and filed under resolved. But the problems started quietly. At first, they were small enough to dismiss. An email sent from my account to a client one I had never written. A compliance document returned to me with numbers slightly altered. A routine travel reimbursement request suddenly delayed for verification. Individually, none of it looked serious. That was the point. Each issue was small enough to look like carelessness, but together, they began forming a pattern that suggested something worse. Then it escalated. One afternoon, a European partner forwarded an email asking for clarification about updated shipping data. The message contained incorrect routing numbers. It had been sent from my address, except I'd never written it. At that point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone inside the company was quietly rewriting my work, altering small details just enough to make it appear as if I were slipping, careless, inconsistent, unreliable. I had spent enough years inside corporate environments to recognize the tactic immediately. This wasn't random. Someone was trying to erode my credibility piece by piece. So I started documenting everything, every suspicious email, every altered file, every login timestamp I could access. I even started keeping a notebook in the top drawer of my desk: dates, times, conversations, anything that might matter later. Because in corporate conflicts, memory is debatable. Documentation isn't. Then one evening, as I was leaving the office late, I heard voices coming from a conference room down the hall. The door wasn't fully closed. Logan Pierce was inside, and one of the newer executives he had hired a few months earlier. I stopped when I heard my name. "She's unstable," Logan said. "She got lucky with that Altair deal." The other executive hesitated. But the board cares about results, Logan cut in. And when her division starts missing targets, they'll start asking whether bringing her back was the right call. There was a short silence. Then Logan added something that made the strategy painfully clear. Once the board loses confidence in her, international operations rolls up to me. I stood quietly in the hallway, listening, and suddenly the past 2 weeks made perfect sense. Logan wasn't trying to fire me anymore. That had already failed. Now he was doing something far more dangerous. He was trying to make the company believe that bringing me back had been the real mistake. About a week later, Daniel Pierce quietly ordered an internal audit. There was no announcement. No company-wide email. Just a small team from compliance and IT working late behind closed conference room doors. Officially, the review was about data irregularities. Unofficially, everyone in senior leadership understood what it really meant. Something inside Apex was manipulating internal communications, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The IT team started with the simplest question. If I hadn't sent those emails, then who had they began tracing activity across the company network? Email edits, document revisions, unusual login attempts. At first, the incidents looked scattered small technical anomalies that could have been dismissed as normal system noise. But once the timestamps were mapped together, a pattern began to emerge. Most of the suspicious activity happened late at night, from shared workstations on the executive floor, and many of the edits were made through a single administrative login account. The credentials belonged to Logan Pierce's executive assistant, the same assistant who had access privileges across multiple departments, which meant something important. Whoever was behind the sabotage had the ability to move quietly through the company's system, sending messages, editing documents, and leaving just enough confusion behind to damage someone's credibility. The audit team documented everything: login histories, server access logs, email routing paths. By the time the report reached Daniel Pierce's desk, the pattern was no longer theoretical. He read the findings alone in his office late that night. And by the time morning came, it was clear the situation could no longer be handled quietly. The auditors requested a formal board session, not a routine update, a closed-door investigation. 12 directors, legal counsel present, evidence presented under review. My name appeared on the attendance list. Technically, I wasn't required to be there. The meeting was about internal systems misuse, not about me, but when the invitation arrived, I accepted. Because if someone inside Apex was trying to destroy my credibility, I wanted to be in the room when the truth finally came out. The boardroom was already quiet when I walked in. 12 directors sat around the long glass table. Legal counsel occupied one end, compliance officers the other. Daniel Pierce stood near the windows overlooking the city, his posture stiff enough to tell anyone watching that this meeting was not routine. Logan Pierce arrived last. He walked in with the same careless confidence I had seen 100 times before, as if whatever this meeting was about, it certainly couldn't be serious. He didn't even look at me. The audit director began without introduction. Evidence appeared on the screen. Email records, internal communications sent under my name, documents that had been altered before being forwarded to clients. The explanation was simple. Someone inside Apex had been quietly manipulating my work. Logan leaned back in his chair. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're taking routine system errors and turning them into sabotage because Claire can't handle the pressure of the job?" The audit director didn't argue. He simply advanced the presentation. The next slide showed system access records, multiple late-night logins, shared workstations on the executive floor, repeated access to internal email routing tools. The timestamps lined up almost perfectly with the altered messages sent to clients. Then the final slide appeared. Security footage? The director said. The screen switched from system logs to video from a hallway camera outside one of the executive workstations. The timestamp matched one of the suspicious email incidents. The footage showed Logan sitting at the terminal. His assistant stood beside him. Logan typed quickly for several seconds, then leaned back in the chair. The microphone in the hallway picked up just enough of what he said next. "Send it. Let's see how long people keep trusting her after this." The video ended. No one in the room moved. Logan's posture had changed. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked less confident than irritated. Daniel Pierce finally spoke. "I gave you every opportunity to prove yourself," he said quietly. Logan didn't answer. The board chairman leaned forward. Legal, he said. Is there any reason the board should delay action? The company's general counsel shook his head. No. Another silence followed. Then the chairman called for a vote. No one defended Logan. His operational authority was immediately suspended. His access to company systems was revoked. 2 weeks later, he resigned from Apex Global entirely. There was no press release, no public explanation, just a quiet departure. But inside the company, everyone knew exactly what had happened. 1 year later, the Apex Spring Gala returned to the Chicago Hilton. The same ballroom, the same chandeliers reflecting light across polished marble floors, and the same quiet conversations between investors, board members, and senior executives holding glasses of champagne, but the atmosphere felt different. Apex Global was no longer a company trying to prove its international expansion would work. The Altair partnership had exceeded every projection. New shipping routes had opened across the Middle East. Revenue from the international division had doubled, and Apex had officially entered 3 new global markets. I stepped into the ballroom a little after 8, not as the director who once ran the division quietly in the background, but as vice president of global partnerships. The title still felt unfamiliar sometimes. Across the room, I recognized several faces: board members, investors, and the Altair delegation, who had returned to renew their contract for another 5-year term. As the music played softly, someone approached me from the strategy team, a younger analyst, nervous, eager, the way people are when they're speaking to someone they've only ever seen across conference tables. Ms. Bennett, he said, "Can I ask you something?" Of course. He hesitated for a moment, then asked the question almost everyone inside Apex had wondered about. How did you stay calm that night? What night, I asked. He nodded toward the center of the ballroom. The gala last year, when Logan threw the drink at you. For a moment, I looked across the room, to the exact spot where I had been standing 12 months earlier. The memory was still sharp. The champagne running down my face, the room falling silent, hundreds of investors and executives watching. I smiled slightly. Because humiliation feels powerful in the moment, I said, but it isn't. The analyst waited, expecting more. So I told him the part people usually learn later. What actually matters, I said, is who controls the structure after the noise dies down. Across the ballroom, the music grew louder and conversations resumed. And for the first time, that night at the gala no longer felt like humiliation. It felt like the moment everything began to change. My name is Emma Langford. I'm 36 years old. And for the past decade, I've worked in systems architecture, the kind of work most people only notice when something breaks. Most people who first meet me assume I'm in operations, or project management, or somewhere in the background where the real decisions supposedly happen. Very few assume I'm the person who built the technology keeping the whole company standing. That morning, I walked into Nexora Systems carrying a slim black folder and a coffee I never got the chance to drink. The lobby was already buzzing with the brittle kind of energy that only comes with big money. Investors from 3 different firms had flown in overnight. Assistants were moving faster than usual. Security looked sharper. Everyone in the building knew this was the morning Nexora was trying to close a $2 billion investment. And the product they were selling to those investors was built around an architecture I had designed 6 years earlier. My architecture? My patent? Legal had personally invited me to the boardroom that morning to finalize the licensing agreement before the deal closed. They had added me to the revised attendance list less than an hour earlier. Whether Maxwell Granger hadn't read it or had simply ignored anything labeled technical, I didn't know yet, but I would have. I reached the glass doors of the boardroom just as the meeting was beginning. Inside, investors lined one side of the long table. Executives filled the other. At the front of the room stood Nexora's new CEO, Maxwell Granger, already halfway through the first slide like the outcome had been decided before anyone sat down. He noticed me near the doorway and gave me a quick glance. The kind men like him give when they've already decided what role a woman must play in the room. Then he smiled. Polite. Empty. I'm sorry, he said calmly. This meeting is for executives. He pointed toward the hallway. Staff can wait outside. A few investors near the far end of the table chuckled. One of them leaned toward another and murmured something about reception. Maxwell didn't correct him. He just nodded once to the assistant by the door. Close it. The glass door shut between us. For a second, I just stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, feeling that old familiar sting. The one that comes from being dismissed before you've even spoken. Then I stepped aside and waited quietly in the hallway because they thought they had just locked a random staff member out of the room. What they didn't realize was that the entire deal they were celebrating depended on something they did not legally control. And I was the one person there who could decide whether they ever would. The hallway outside Nexora's main boardroom was all glass and polished concrete, the kind of corporate design meant to look open and modern while quietly making it clear who belonged inside and who didn't. I stood a few feet from the door, close enough to hear voices through the glass, but far enough that no one inside bothered to look at me again. Inside. Maxwell Granger was already moving through the opening slides of his presentation, gesturing confidently toward the screen like a man who believed the outcome of the meeting had already been decided. Outside. The rest of the office carried on with its Monday morning rhythm. Two junior executives walked past first. One of them slowed just long enough to glance at the folder in my hands. "Hey," he said casually, handing me a stack of printed reports. "Could you drop these in there after the meeting?" He didn't wait for an answer. Just kept walking. I looked down at the papers for a second. Then I set them neatly on a small console table against the wall and went back to where I'd been standing. A few minutes later, someone from operations stopped nearby, scrolling through emails on his phone. He glanced up at me briefly. "Are they doing coffee service in there?" he asked. "If you're headed in later, could you bring a few more cups?" I could have corrected him. I didn't. After nearly 10 years working in technology companies, I had learned something simple about authority. Most people decide who you are in the first 3 seconds they see you. Not by what you've built, not by what you know, by how easily they think they can categorize you. Through the glass door, I could see the presentation slide filling the screen now. Next Generation Energy Stabilization Platform. Maxwell stood beside it, explaining the architecture to a room full of investors. Flow diagrams stretched across the slide. Data pipelines, load balancing layers, automated optimization models. Every line of that system looked familiar, because I knew it by memory. I had written every piece of it 6 years earlier, in a cramped office 3 floors below that boardroom, when Nexora had been one failed quarter away from shutting its doors. Back then, no one cared what my title was. They only cared whether the system would work. Now the company was finally successful. And somehow, I had become the easiest person in the building to overlook. From the hallway, Maxwell's voice carried clearly through the glass, confident, smooth, the kind of tone people use when they're selling certainty. Inside the boardroom, the slide changed again. Maxwell paced slowly across the front of the room, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table as he spoke. "This platform," he said, "is the backbone of Nexora's next phase of growth." He paused, letting the words settle over the room. "With the right capital behind it, we expect to dominate the energy optimization market within the next 18 months. Several investors nodded. One of them leaned forward slightly. What about scalability? Maxwell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the CFO seated halfway down the table. Our CFO tapped his pen once against the table before speaking. "The architecture already supports most of Nexora's internal systems," he explained. "Scheduling, reporting, client dashboards, data routing. Roughly 80% of our infrastructure runs through that platform." A quiet murmur of approval moved around the table. One investor flipped through the briefing packet in front of him, and the patent protection he asked. Maxwell didn't hesitate. "The intellectual property is fully secured." I stood quietly outside the door and listened. 6 years earlier, that system hadn't existed. Back then, Nexora had been drowning in technical debt after a disastrous acquisition. Servers were crashing weekly, clients were threatening to leave. Half the engineering team had already quit. So I rebuilt the back-end architecture from the ground up, layer by layer, line by line. The previous CEO had insisted we protect the design properly, file the patent under your name. He told me at the time, "If leadership ever changes, I want the company forced to respect the person who built this." And so we did. The company received a licensing agreement to operate the system I designed, but Nexora never actually owned the technology. They only licensed it. And that licensing agreement had one important condition. Renewal required my signature. I glanced down at the time on my phone. 11:38 a.m. The license expired at noon. Inside the boardroom, they were celebrating a future built on that platform. What none of them seemed to realize was that in 22 minutes, they might not legally be allowed to use it anymore. Inside the boardroom, the presentation moved from technology to money. The slide on the screen shifted to projected revenue curves and global expansion targets. Numbers climbed sharply upward across the display, the kind designed to make investors lean forward in their chairs. Maxwell stood beside the screen like a man presenting a future that had already been secured. With the capital structure we're proposing, he said, Nexora will be able to scale deployment internationally within 12 months. One of the investors folded his hands together. Walk us through the funding structure again. Maxwell nodded easily. $2 billion in staged investment. Initial deployment capital followed by infrastructure expansion once licensing and rollout are finalized. Licensing. The word drifted into the hallway like a quiet warning bell. Inside the room, no one seemed particularly concerned about it. Another investor flipped through the documents in front of him. The valuation assumptions rely entirely on the stabilization platform, and he said, if that system performs the way you claim, the projections make sense. Our testing results have been extremely strong. Maxwell replied, the architecture is already running across most of our infrastructure. The CFO confirmed it with a short nod, approximately 80%. The investor studied the briefing packet for another moment. Then he looked up. Before we sign anything, he said calmly, confirm the patent rights. The room fell briefly quiet. Maxwell answered immediately, with the casual certainty of someone who had never bothered to read the underlying agreement himself. Our company owns the core patent. Through the glass, I watched the CFO glance down at the legal documents in front of him. Just for a moment. Most people wouldn't have noticed the hesitation, but I did, because I knew exactly what document he was looking at, and what it actually said. Maxwell continued speaking as if nothing was uncertain. Intellectual property security was one of the first things we reviewed during the transition. The CFO didn't interrupt him, but he didn't look entirely comfortable either. Standing in the hallway, I realized something that shifted the entire situation. Maxwell Granger was pitching a $2 billion investment based on a technology he believed Nexora owned. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. They didn't own it at all. And the man promising it to investors didn't even know that yet. Inside the boardroom, the presentation continued as if everything were perfectly under control. Slides advanced. Investors asked careful questions. Maxwell answered each one with the smooth confidence of a man who believed the deal was already done. I remained in the hallway. A few minutes later, the glass door opened briefly. One of Nexora's senior product executives stepped halfway into the corridor, scanning the hallway as if he were looking for someone. Then he noticed me standing there. His expression tightened slightly with confusion. You're still here. The question sounded less angry than mildly inconvenienced, like I was a problem that should have solved itself by now. You know reception is down the hall. Right, he added. They can help you if you're waiting for someone. Inside the boardroom, someone chuckled. Another voice followed, louder this time. Maybe she's waiting to serve coffee. A few quiet laughs drifted through the doorway. The executive shook his head slightly, as if the situation was beneath further attention, and stepped back into the room. The glass door closed again. Through the glass, I could see Maxwell moving toward the final slide of the presentation. A world map appeared on the screen behind him. With this investment, he said confidently, Nexora won't just compete in this market. He paused for emphasis. We'll control it. Several investors nodded. One of them was already reviewing the final signature pages of the investment agreement. From where I stood, I could see the contracts moving slowly around the table, pens being uncapped, pages turning. They were minutes away from signing. I checked the time again, 11:52 a.m., 10 minutes before the licensing agreement expired. 8 minutes before the system powering most of Nexora's infrastructure stopped being legally available to them. Inside the boardroom, they were building their entire future around technology they believed already belonged to them. And none of them had realized yet that the one person who controlled it was still standing outside the door. Inside the boardroom, the final slide was already on the screen. Revenue projections, market expansion, a timeline that assumed everything in the room would proceed exactly as planned. Maxwell stood beside the display, relaxed now, like a man already imagining the press release. That was when the lead investor raised his hand. Before we finalize this, he said calmly, I need confirmation on one point. The room quieted almost immediately. Maxwell turned toward him. Still smiling, of course. The investor tapped the briefing packet in front of him. Who currently holds the patent rights to the stabilization platform. For a brief moment, No one spoke. Then Maxwell answered without hesitation. Nexora Systems. He said it easily, like the answer was obvious. Across the table, the CFO opened the legal binder in front of him and began turning pages. The movement was subtle, but it broke the rhythm of the room. Paper shifted, pens paused. Maxwell continued speaking as if the matter had already been settled. Our company fully controls the intellectual property behind the system. The lead investor didn't smile. At this level, he said evenly, nothing about ownership is procedural. The CFO stopped turning pages. He stared down at one document for a second longer than comfortable. The licensing confirmation? He said slowly. Maxwell glanced toward him. It hasn't been signed yet. A faint ripple moved through the room. Maxwell waved a dismissive hand. That's procedural, he said. Legal housekeeping. The lead investor leaned back in his chair. Ownership, he replied calmly, is never housekeeping. The CFO closed the binder but didn't look up. From the hallway, I checked the time on my phone again. 11:56 a.m. 4 minutes before the licensing agreement expired. 4 minutes before the system powering most of Nexora's business stopped being legally available to them. That was how long Nexora had before the licensing agreement expired. 8 minutes before the technology they were presenting stopped legally belonging to them. Inside the boardroom, Maxwell had already resumed speaking, confidently walking the investors through the closing structure of the deal. By then, I had heard enough. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at the glass door again. Because if they were about to finalize a $2 billion investment based on a system they didn't legally control, someone in that room needed to hear the truth before the clock hit noon. And it was clear no one inside was going to say it. 11:57 a.m., 3 minutes before the licensing agreement expired, inside the boardroom, Maxwell had already returned to the closing slide of the presentation. The room sounded relaxed now, confident, like the hard questions had already been answered. I stood in the hallway for another second, listening. By then, I had heard enough to understand exactly what kind of leadership Nexora had chosen. That mattered more than any contract. So I reached for the handle and pushed the glass door open. The room went quiet almost immediately. Maxwell turned first. The irritation on his face appeared before the recognition did. Excuse me, he said sharply. This is a private meeting. Several investors looked up at the same time. One of them leaned toward another and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. Then someone closer to the door spoke quietly. Isn't that the woman they told to wait outside? A small murmur moved around the table. Maxwell's expression hardened. This meeting is for executives. For a moment, no one moved. Then I stepped into the room. The sound of my heels crossing the floor echoed softly across the boardroom. No one tried to stop me. No one tried to... By that point, they were too busy trying to understand why I looked so calm. I walked to the center of the table and placed my folder down in front of Maxwell. The sound of paper touching polished wood felt louder than anything else in the room. Maxwell frowned. I believe we already asked you to wait outside. I glanced around the table once. At the investors, at the CFO, at the stack of unsigned contracts sitting near the lead investor's hand. Then I looked back at Maxwell. Good, I said calmly. If this meeting is for executives, I paused just long enough for the room to focus completely. Then the person who owns the patent should probably be here. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence that followed didn't feel like confusion. It felt like the exact moment a room realizes something it should have known all along. For a moment, Maxwell didn't react. Then he laughed. Not loudly, just enough to signal to the investors that nothing serious had happened. Our legal team secured the patent months ago, he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. I'm sure there's some misunderstanding. A few investors relaxed slightly. They wanted that answer to be true. I tilted my head. Interesting. Maxwell's smile held, because in his mind, there were only two possibilities. Either I was confused, or I didn't understand the documents. I opened the folder slowly. Because, I said calmly, I never sold it. The room shifted. A few chairs moved slightly against the floor. Maxwell's expression tightened. But he still tried to maintain control. That's impossible, he said quickly. Our legal department. I slid the documents across the table. Patent registration, ownership filing, licensing agreement, 3 pieces of paper. The CFO picked them up first. At the beginning, his face stayed neutral. Then his eyes slowed as he read. He flipped to the next page and then the next. The room waited. Finally, he spoke. She's listed as the sole patent holder. His voice was quieter now. Across the table, Maxwell leaned forward. That's not correct. The CFO didn't look up. It is. One of the investors reached for the document and read the header. United States Patent Registration. Owner Emma Langford. The room went still. The lead investor looked at me carefully now, not dismissively, not politely, seriously. You're telling me, he said slowly, that the core technology Nexora is presenting to us, he gestured toward the screen behind Maxwell, legally belongs to you. I nodded once. Correct. No one spoke for several seconds, because everyone in the room understood what that meant. The platform Nexora was selling, the infrastructure running 80% of their company, the technology behind a $2 billion investment did not belong to Nexora. It belonged to the woman they had asked to wait outside the room. For several seconds, no one spoke. The room had gone completely still. The lead investor looked down at the patent document again, reading the header more carefully this time. Then he looked toward the CFO. Let me understand this correctly, he said slowly. If the patent belongs to her, he gestured toward me. What exactly does Nexora own? The CFO exhaled. Not dramatically. Just the quiet kind of breath someone takes before saying something everyone in the room already suspects. We operate the infrastructure, he said carefully. But the core architecture itself, he tapped the document lightly, is licensed technology. Licensed, another investor repeated. The word moved around the room like a warning. And the license expires today, the CFO added. Several investors immediately began flipping through their briefing packets. One of them scanned the licensing clause again. If she doesn't renew the agreement, he said slowly. You can't sell this product. The CFO shook his head. No. Another investor leaned forward. You can't scale the system. No. And you certainly can't raise $2 billion around a platform you don't legally control. This time the silence cut deeper. The lead investor closed the folder. Then he stood. Then there is no deal. Across the table, Maxwell finally looked like someone who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. That's not necessary, he said quickly. We can resolve this. The lead investor didn't sit back down. You told us your company owned the intellectual property, he said evenly. Maxwell glanced toward the CFO again. Looking for support, the CFO didn't speak. Around the table, voices began overlapping, investors asking questions, legal advisors requesting clarification, executives searching through documents that should have been reviewed weeks earlier. The confident energy that had filled the boardroom 30 minutes earlier was gone. Now it sounded like a crisis meeting. I watched the room quietly for a moment. Then I closed the folder and gathered the papers from the table. That was when Maxwell finally looked directly at me, like in that moment, I could see it clearly on his face. The realization, the woman he had told to wait outside the room now controlled the future of his company. I was halfway to the door when Maxwell's chair scraped loudly across the floor. Emma, wait! His voice sounded very different now. The confidence from earlier that morning was gone. I paused but didn't turn around immediately. We can fix this, he said quickly. There's no reason to walk away. Let's sit down and renegotiate the licensing agreement. The room had gone quiet again. Even the investors had stopped talking. Everyone was watching. I turned back slowly. When legal invited me this morning, I said calmly, that was exactly the plan. Maxwell blinked. I came here prepared to finalize the licensing agreement before this meeting began. I tapped the folder lightly against my hand. All the paperwork was ready. Several of the investors exchanged quiet looks. Maxwell glanced toward the stack of unsigned contracts on the table. So, let's finish it now, he said. We can still move forward. For a moment, I studied him. Then I shook my head. Not today. His expression tightened. This isn't about the money. I continued. The licensing terms haven't changed. I gestured toward the boardroom door behind me. What changed was the introduction. A few investors leaned back in their chairs. The sentence landed heavier than anything else said that morning. I stepped closer to the door and rested my hand on the handle. Next time you tell someone to wait outside, I paused just long enough for the entire room to look up. Make sure they don't own the future of your company. No one responded. They didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. Behind me, the boardroom erupted again. Investors questioning leadership, legal advisors flipping through contracts, Executives trying to understand how something this important had been overlooked. But I didn't stop walking because power doesn't always announce itself when it enters a room. Sometimes it waits quietly in the hallway until the moment everyone inside has underestimated it.